Hi, fourth graders. I'm going to read chapter 19 for you right now of The Borrowers. We left off in a really good place. We are almost done, and I hope that you are enjoying following along. Okay. That's what you are, and so are they. They're nasty, little, crafty, scampy, scurvy, squeaking little. No, they're not, he put in quickly. And you're in a league with them. She came across to him, and taking him by his arm, she jerked him to his feet. You know what they did with the thieves? She asked. No, he said. They locked them up. That is what they do with the thieves, and that's what's going to happen to you. I'm not a thief, cried the boy, his lips trembling. I'm a borrower. A what? She swung him around by tightening the grip on his arm. A borrower, he repeated. There were tears on his eyelids. He hoped they would not fall. So that is what you call it, as he had done so long ago, it seemed now, that day, with Arrietty. That's their name, he said, the kind of people they are. They are borrowers. Borrowers, huh? Repeated Mrs. Driver wonderingly. She laughed. Well, they've done all the borrowing they're ever going to do in this house. She began to drag him toward the door. The tears spilled over his eyes and ran down his cheeks. Don't hurt them, he begged. I'll move them. I promise I know how. Mrs. Driver laughed again and pushed him roughly through the green door. They'll be moved all right, she said. Don't worry. The rat catcher will know how. Crampfurl's old cat will know how. So will the sanitary inspector and the fire brigade if need be. The police will know how. I shouldn't wonder. No need to worry about moving them once you've found the nest, she went on, dropping her voice to a vicious whisper as they passed Aunt Sophie's door. The rest is easy. She pushed him into the schoolroom and locked the door, and he heard the boards of the passage creak beneath her, tread as satisfied she moved away. He crept into bed, and then he was cold and cried his heart out under his blankets. And that, said Mrs. May, laying down her crochet hook, is really the end. Kate stared at her. Oh, it can't be, she gasped. Please. The last square, said Mrs. May, smoothing it out on her knee, the 150th. Now we can sew them together. Oh, said Kate, breathing again. The quilt. I thought you meant the story. It's the end of the story, too, said Mrs. May, or the beginning. He never saw them again, and she began to sort out the squares. But, stammered Kate, you can't mean, it's not fair, she cried. It's cheating. Tears sprang to her eyes. She threw her work down on the table and her crochet hook after it, and she kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. Why, Kate, why? Mrs. May looked genuinely surprised. Something more must have happened, cried Kate angrily. What about the rat catcher and the policeman and the... But something did happen, said Mrs. May. A lot more happened. I will tell you. Then why did you say it was the end? Because, said Mrs. May, she still looked surprised, he never saw them again. Then how could there be more? Because, Mrs. May, there is a lot more. Kate glared at her. All right, she said, go on. Mrs. May looked back at her. Kate, she said, after a moment, stories never really end. They go on and on and on. It's just that sometimes, at a certain point, one stops telling them. But not at this kind of point, said Kate. Well, thread your needle, said Mrs. May, with gray wool this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top, and you can start at the bottom. First a gray square, then a green, then a pink, and so on. Then, you really didn't mean it, said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle, when you said that he never saw them again. But I did mean it, said Mrs. May. I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave suddenly at the end of the week because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him. And for the 3 days before he left, they kept him locked up in 2 rooms. For 3 days? Said Kate. Yes, Mrs. Driver, it seemed, told Aunt Sophie, that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she got rid of the borrowers. Did she? Asked Kate. Did they all come? The policeman, the rat catcher, and the sanitary inspector didn't come. At least, not while my brother was there. And they didn't have the rat catcher from town hall, but they had the local man, the policeman. During these 3 days, Mrs. Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, it became kind of neutral. She used to bring his meals up, and then on that first morning, she thought about the doll's furniture up on the breakfast tray and made my brother climb the shelves and put it back in the doll's house. It was then when she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was. Why? Said Kate. Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runacre's son Ernie, a boy Mrs. Driver had chased many a time for stealing russet apples from the tree by the gate. A nasty, no good, thieving dribbit of good for nothing, she told my brother, sitting down there, he now in the kitchen, large as life, with his notebook out, laughing, said, and it was he, round-eyed dribbit of no good. Of course not. And more than my brother was. Any more than my brother was. Ernie Runacre was a fine, upstanding young man and a credit to the police force, and he did not actually laugh at Mrs. Driver when she told him her story, but he gave her what Crampfurl spoke of afterwards as an old-fashioned look when she described homily. Take more water with it, it seemed to say. More water with what? Asked Kate. And Great Aunt Sophie had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Mrs. Driver had seen several little people when she herself couldn't be sure. Crampfurl had to bring all of anything interesting that they may have left down there upstairs. Put things back in Aunt Sophie's bedroom and keep an eye on it. Did they get the cat? Asked Kate. Yes, they did, but that wasn't much of a success either. It was Crampfurl's cat, a large yellow Tom with white streaks. According to Mrs. Driver, it only had two ideas in its head, to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of borrowers, Mrs. Driver would say as she slammed down the fish pie for my brother's lunch. That cat is a borrower, if ever there was one. Borrowed the fish, the cat did, and a good half bowl of egg sauce. But the cat wasn't there long. The first thing the rat-catching terrier did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set, too, my brother said. They chased it everywhere, upstairs and down, in and out of all the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking away through the spinney and across the fields with all the terriers after it. Did they catch it? No, Mrs. May said. She laughed. It was still there when I went a year later. A little sad, but as fit as a fiddle. Tell about when you went. Oh, I wasn't there long, said Mrs. May, rather hastily, and after that house was sold, my brother never went back again. Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lower lip. So they never caught those little people? She said at last. Mrs. May's eyes flickered away. No, they never actually caught them. But, she hesitated, as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse. Mrs. May laid down her work and started for a moment. She thought thoughtfully at her idle hands. I hated the rat-catcher, she said. Why did you know him? Everybody knew him. He had a wall eye, and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig killer, and, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, and a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke was exactly. Poison fumes of some kind, which he made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung around the barn or wherever it had been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that third day, the day he was leaving, when suddenly he smelled that smell. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed and down in the hall. Mrs. Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage to Aunt Sophie. He stood there, stiff and pale, in gloves and an overcoat, beside the curtained bed. Seasick already? Aunt Sophie mocked him, peering down at him over the edge of the great mattress. No, he said, it's that smell. Aunt Sophie lifted her nose. She sniffed. What smell is it, Driver? It's the rat-catcher, my lady, explained Mrs. Driver, reddening, down in the kitchen. What? Exclaimed Aunt Sophie. Are you smoking them out? and she began to laugh. Oh dear, she gasped. What if you don't like them? Driver, the remedy is simple. What is that, my lady? Mrs. Driver asked coldly, but even her chin was red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ringed hand toward her, and her eyes were screwed up and screwed up and her shoulders shaking. Keep the bottle corked, she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing, still, as they went down the stairs. She don't believe in them, muttered Mrs. Driver. She tightened her grip on my brother's arm. More fool her. She'll change her tune. Like enough when I take them up afterward, laid out in sizes on a clean piece of newspaper. And she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscoting, and my brother saw at once the hole had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bag still stood beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the garden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals. Petals were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. Plenty of time, said Mrs. Driver, glancing up at the clock. The cab's not due till 3:30. The clock has stopped, said my brother. Mrs. Driver turned. She was wearing her hat, her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. So it has, she said. Her jaw dropped. Her cheeks became heavy. It's moving, it decided after a moment. It'll be all right, she went on, once we get it back. Mrs. Frith comes on Monday, and she dragged again at his arm above the elbow. Where are we going? He asked, holding back. Along to the kitchen. We've got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see them get caught? No, he said no, and he pulled away from her. Mrs. Driver stared at him, smiling a little. I do. I'd like to see them close. He puffs the stuff in, and they come running out. At least that's how it works with rats. But first, he says, you'll block up all the exits, and her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscoting. How do they find it? The boy asked. Puttied it looked, and with a square brown paper pasted on crooked. Rich William found it. That is his job. They could unstick it, said the boy after a moment. Mrs. Driver laughed. Oh, no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is, a great block of it, right inside, with a sheet of iron across from the front of that old stove in the outhouse. He and Cramp Furl had to have the morning room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they were working up until tea time. We're going to have no more capers of that kind, not under that clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want to keep time. See where it stood, where the floors washed away? It was then my brother saw for the first time, and last time, that raised platform of unscrubbed stone. Come on now, said Mrs. Driver, and took him by the arm. We'll hear the cab from the kitchen. But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the door, had lots of sound. No approaching cab could be heard. What with yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices, steady, 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 Cramp Furl was saying, on one loud note as he held back the rat catcher's dogs, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policemen were there. Nellie Runacre's son Ernie, he had come out of interest and stood back from the others a little in view of his calling. He had a cup of tea in his hand and his helmet pushed off his forehead, but his face was pink with boyish excitement, and he stirred the teaspoon round and round. Seeing is believing, he said cheerfully to Mrs. Driver when she saw her come in at the door. A boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said, and the boy kept pushing it back in. Rich William himself was crouched on the floor by the hole. He had alighted something beneath a piece of sacking, and the stench of it smoldering eddied about the room. He was working the bellows now with infinite care, stooping over them, rapt and tense. My brother stood there as though in a dream. Perhaps it was, he said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed around the kitchen. He saw sunlit fruit trees through the window, and a bough of the cherry tree which stood upon the bank. He saw empty teacups on the table with spoons stuck in them, and one without a saucer. He saw, propped against the wall, closed behind the door, the rat catcher's belongings: a frayed coat patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit mares, 2 sacks, a spade, a gun, and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. There was going to be a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. "Stand by, ready now to slip the dogs." Mrs. Driver let go of her brother's arm. Mrs. Driver let go of my brother's arm and moved toward the hole. "Keep back," said the rat catcher without turning. "Give us room," said Mrs. Driver, back nervously toward the table. She put a chair beside it and half raised knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runacre's mocking glance. "All right, Ma," he said, moving his eyebrow up. "We'll give you a leg up when the time comes," said Mrs. Driver. Threw him a furious look. And Mrs. Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up 3 cups from the table and stomped away with them angrily into the scullery, seeming less much of something or other. My brother heard her mutter as she brushed past him, and the words that she said suddenly, my brother, came to life. He threw a quick glance into the kitchen. The men were absorbed. All eyes were on the rat catcher, except those of the village boy who was getting out his ferret. My brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards slowly toward the door, and he moved gently, stuffing his gloves into his pocket. He kept his eyes on the group around the hole. He paused a moment beside the rat catcher's tools and stretched out a wary, groping hand. His fingers were closed at last on a wooden handle. Smooth it was and worn with wear. He glanced down quickly to make sure. Yes, it was, as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed, and against the door with his shoulders it opened sweetly in its silent way. Not one of the men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment like this to go right through, and there ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." My brother slid the barely open door and its side to behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, and then he ran. There was a hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock and struck a trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulder and aimed a sideways blow at the hole below the wainscot. The paper tore, a few crumbs of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe resounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he was struck, and again the wainscot above the hole became split and scratched, and the paper hung down in strips. But still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping on the wood. He paused for a breath, and looking out, he saw the cab. He saw it on the road beyond the hedge of the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn into the driveway. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result perhaps of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. Time, that is what he needed. A little more time. It takes a moment, like the rat catcher had said, to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor. Ventilation, that was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out the door. He stumbled once on the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him a sharp blow on the temple. Already, when he reached it, a thin filament of smoke was coming out of the grating, and he thought as he ran toward it that there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars, and that was where they could be, of course, to get air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard, behind him, the crunch of wheels on the gravel and the sound of the horse's hooves. He was not, as I have told you, a very strong little boy, and he was only 9, not 10, as he had boasted to Arrietty. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered up the bank and threw the pickaxe with all his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking, as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, toward the cab, how that, too, the loss of the pickaxe would cause its own kind of trouble later. Okay. Stop right there.